So, one of the things that you probably have read enough about Paticca Samuppada is to know that it's got value and importance in both directions. So that they look at it forward, and then they look at it backwards, and then they review it forward and backwards is basically the way that you would look at it. One of the reasons why that would happen is, think about any individual position along this state of process that goes from one dependent origination, that origination now becomes the dependency for the next origination. So any one of those places now, we can see that, oh, if we were at this place, examining this place or inspecting this thing, then it's got two questions to ask. What comes next and what caused it?
Yeah.
In other words, what comes next is, what is this process piece going to create or cause in the next process? And so we begin to examine the links that way. And most logically is to learn them in order from the beginning up through the end. But the way that we practice it is in reverse order. And we practice it in the sense that if this is a sequence of events, step by step as they go down the way, then that means that when the student is learning to watch this stuff, he's going to more likely catch later things than he is to catch the early things. And so the process of training the mind within Paticca Samuppada is to begin in reverse order and back up through it until we begin to see how things really operate, not in because it's an intellectual understanding, but because we can see the thing in operation. Or we can see all of the things as they're cooperating. Now, we use the word cooperating in the sense of fitting together. But in the regard that I'm using the word cooperation here is that each individual piece is just operating. But they're not all cooperating. They're just operating on the thing that's next to them. So it's not a full-blown cooperation, but it is, in fact, each aspect will operate in turn depending upon the cause and effect, very much like a domino. Look at any individual, you know what we mean by the domino effect? And that they have sometimes very sophisticated ones, where the students will get thousands and thousands of dominoes, and it takes maybe a minute or two to run through them all. And they wind up with a kind of a Rubik machine. Rube Goldberg machine, rather, is what I'm thinking about, not a Rubik cube.
What's that?
Very complicated machinery to do very simple things.
All right.
All right.
Yeah, I just had to think, because in another book, it's called Seeing That Freeze. It's about emptiness, and the author says that you can look at it sequentially, but there's also actually cross effects of distant parts, and they are dependent on each other to even exist. So he says actually everything has to do with everything, if I understood him right. So I was just trying to fit that together.
Well, while that may be true in reality, and it may be also true and physiologically within a concept, we're really not going to be able to see that until we're really, really deep into Paticca Samuppada.
Okay.
All right.
Yeah.
But yes, in fact, that's what's growing towards the Dhamma. This is why Bhikkhu Buddhadasa would say that the Dhamma is God, and that the Christians try to make it by giving God a personality. They make it very small rather than completely expansive. And that one of the ways of talking about it is using the word environment, because that's literally our God, our Dhamma. But we're not merely in the environment, we're part of the environment.
Right, yeah.
And that everything is interconnected.
Yeah.
Everything is interconnected. And in fact, this dependent origination, which means, actually the word for it in Pali would be idiapapajayata. And that would mean in the sense of, with this there is that, and without this there is not that. In the time of the Buddha, because they weren't really nearly as scientific as we are nowadays, would use the example like nutriment. That this is a nutriment for that. And various things have various nutriments. For instance, the object that the eye sees is nutriment for the eye. It feeds the eye. What does it feed the eye? The image is what is fed to the eye. All right, so this is an example of what we mean by that. And the cause and effect is going on at an extraordinary high speed. That physics is, here's the thing that's so amazing is that whatever causes and effects that would have to go on inside of a camera, there would be so many of them is that then the camera would not be able to take a photo of one cause-effect cycle. But we do know that it is so fast that light is a wave, because the waviness is a cause and effect relationship right down at a very, very deep level that's much higher speed than the speed of light. That in fact, what they're beginning to see is that the speed of light is based on causality, that there are causes and effects that are happening at the basically the sub element level, that are happening so fast that we really don't have a clue yet. But we're getting there. We're going in that direction. So now what we look at is to bring that up, not necessarily at the speed of it, but now look at the broad scope of it, in the sense that almost every molecule in the universe is being simultaneously bombarded, and or it becomes the effect of all of the other molecules. Some of them are in close proximity and have the most, but without those further reaches out there, it wouldn't quite be the same. And now we're beginning to see, wait a minute, things are getting enormously intellectually complex. Yes. And that's what we're beginning to shoot for also within the concept of Paticca Samuppada, is to come to the point of opening our senses as best we can, and then staying with open senses so that we can begin to get a load of just how complex things are happening right now. And it's amazing when you start thinking about it. It's like, wow, you're right. I mean, look how much is happening all at the same time. Every fiber of that couch that you're sitting on is vibrating, whether it's touching your body or not. Every fiber of that couch is responding to your sitting there, whether you're sitting on that particular fiber or not. Because they're all in a relationship. Those that are pushed down the most are now tugging on the ones that are on the outside, and everything bends towards you and your center of gravity. It's
Yeah.
amazing like that, because everything has got gravity and everything has got electromagnetic properties. And the electromagnetic properties, in fact, are what keeps things from becoming a black hole. Why don't you just go right through your couch, right down to the center? And why don't you take the couch with you, right on down through the floor and down through the ground? And by the way, why doesn't the ground come too? The answer is it's the electromagnetic force that keeps them there. In other words, you sitting in your chair, the clothing that you have on will not allow your body to go through that clothing because of the at the molecular level, the interrelation of the electrons. In other words, these electrons that are in this orbit of this machine or element say, wait a minute, I'm not going to let you pass through my field at all. You stay out of my field, you stay in your own field, because that's going to take an enormous amount of energy to push that through at electromagnetic way. That's why you can actually sit in a chair.
Okay, so what keeps matter separated from other matter is
The
electromagnetic.
electromagnetic fields.
Ah,
It's the electrons that do.
because I could never fully grasp the concept of electromagnetism.
Electromagnetism is nothing but the spinning of the wheels of each individual atom. And very, very heavy, dense atoms means that they will also have an associated number of electrons, but those electrons will have at most 8 in any one particular valence. And so the valence electrons is an energy shift. That it takes a lot of energy to put electrons out there and get them to speed up so that they match the electrons on the inside. So that the electrons generally on the outside field are running at fully the speed of light in order to get around in time to be in sync with all of the others. This is at basic physics, but what we're talking about is that at that particular level, everything becomes interconnected and interrelated. This is an example of, about surface tension on water. What is surface tension? Now they're beginning to understand surface tension is actually an electromagnetic field that's caused by the hydrogen molecules that are coming out of the atmosphere that are just always in the atmosphere. But whenever there's a surface layer of water, then those hydrogen molecules will bond, changing both the molecular structure and the electromagnetic charge, so that little animals like water skaters, won't penetrate that level and go right into the liquid of the water. It's that layer of electrons that are associated with that first highly top layer of the water that prevents that water skater from going right into the liquid. It's quite amazing. But what we're beginning to understand is, wait a minute, we thought that humans liked to study physics because we wanted to figure things out. We wanted to take things that were hard to understand and make them simple so that we can understand. And what we're winding up with is more and more and more and more complexity. An example of that is the formula-wise, Newton's law of gravity equations only got 4, 5, 6 elements in it, where you two masses multiplied by together, divided by the square of the distance between them, plus the gravitational constant, which is pretty close to 2. And you've got it. That's all you need. But Einstein's law of gravity is extraordinarily complex, generally taking 2 lines of a mathematician on the blackboard to get it all down.
Mm-hmm.
In that regard, things go more and more and more complex, and that's exactly what's happening here, is that we're beginning to see the complexity of it, but the complexity of it all is absolutely magnificent. It's awe-inspiring to just think about how we can sit in a chair. And just by feeling that chair, but we're doing all of that stuff right in the here now. This is not past and future. This is actually stuff worth looking at. How can I sit in a chair? How can that happen? How can the chair support my body? Well, it's not really supporting it, not the chair itself, but down at the molecular level. That plastic bond that is in that polynomial, or polyester, or whatever the word would be for that kind of plastic, is just not going to let the molecules of the cloth in this pair of pants to go through it. Just not going to happen. Because of all of the energy. It's basically all energy. Everything winds up being energy and energy's relationship to mass. Now, here's the important point. Let's go right into Paticca Samuppada now, because let's start at the very, very basic beginning. At the very basic beginning, the Pali word is a jiva, and that means ignorance. And humans want to make things simple, when in fact things are often really complex. Now, here's something that's really also very interesting, is the same jiva is considered not only a fetter, but the highest fetter. Why is that there? Is because when all of the other fetters are completely eradicated, the one thing that's going to be left is the fact that an arahant is not all-knowing. That's not going to happen. That the arahant winds up being, with all of the other stuff, he still has ignorance. But now he relishes in it. It's a true friend to just say, I don't know, but isn't it marvelous? It's a wonderment.
Oh, yeah. I've never heard it talked about like this before, I think. I always heard like, yeah, it's getting rid of all ignorance and then you're enlightened.
No, you're not going to get rid of ignorance. You're going to get rid of some of it. But the more you do, the more you'll figure out that you don't. And that we eventually have to leave it to the point that we are in a vast Dhamma that we have no control over. That the only thing that we have control over is our own body-mind complex, and that's extremely limited also. That as we've talked, you are not the body. Body is not self. It's not me, not mine. But it still is a wonderment. In fact, there's so much about it. Medical science just keeps going on and on and on and on and on, because they're finding more and more and more things to look at, more and more to be interested in. And in fact, from time to time, almost all of medical science gets turned on its head. For instance, the germ theory, boy, did that change medical science. When Louis Pasteur came along. So getting back to this quality of ignorance, every human being is born at the state of birth extraordinarily ignorant compared to what that child will be when he's adult. That there's a vast learning curve that children go through. But when a child is born, it doesn't really have any control even over its hands. Doesn't have control over its eyes. That in fact, that's one of the things that mothers will do, is they'll put motion in front of the child to see if you can get the child to start tracking, start looking and gazing and beginning to use the eyes rather than just have them limp there. one of the reasons why they put mobiles to let the child see it, but also for the child to grasp it, to learn to use his hands. So we start off really ignorant. And sometimes that child will make mistakes and not learn from that mistake and continue to make that same mistake over and over and over again. This is especially true with feelings. An example would be in a nursery, you've got 3-year-olds. And one 3-year-old is playing with a truck. And another 3-year-old sees that fellow playing with his truck, and he likes that, and he wants to play too. And so what does he do? He goes and grabs the truck because he thinks the pleasure that child is, the other child is having, is coming from the truck itself. And that's a basic mistake that we make at the age of 3, and we continue that mistake our whole lives. The mistake is, he's playing with a truck, he's happy, therefore the truck makes him happy. I want the truck. And sometimes it goes from, pardon?
Yeah, so we externalize the pleasure feelings and project it towards things instead of inside created.
And we make that mistake when we're very, very young, and no one ever bothers to correct us because everybody else that we're around, all the teachers and all the nurses and all the doctors, all the aunts and the uncles, everybody is making that same mistake. Mom and dad and the older siblings, everybody makes the mistake that happiness comes from the outside. That's a basic point of ignorance. But now we can multiply that 10,000. Like when you see a girl with a pretty dress on, the little girl sees a girl with the pretty dress on, she gets angry. She gets jealous. I want to dress like that too. Now, the right thing to do for that was, oh, I like your dress. Oh, that's so beautiful on you. I would really like it if I had a dress like that too. But many little girls, they don't do it like that. They'll go up and make a problem instead. They don't go to make friends. They go to make enemies because that girl has what I want. And so here we are again, is not only are we making the mistake that I'm going to get my happiness from the outside world, but now I'm beginning to make mistakes about how I feel when I don't get what I want. And so when we're little kids, we make a lot of mistakes, and then we keep perpetuating those mistakes, sometimes even when people try to correct us with them, but we don't. And that winds up being what the personality is persistently making the same mistakes over and over and over again, both logic mistakes and emotional mistakes.
Yeah. It doesn't help that everybody seems to think that way, and they also reinforce this way of thinking.
Exactly. And so this basic ignorance that we're talking about changes from the kind of ignorance that the infant has, which is simply just not knowing and kind of knowing that you don't know. That's actual ignorance. There's another kind of ignorance, or ajiva, and that is delusion. And the delusion is when we think we know the right thing to do, but it was not the right thing to do. We were wrong or incorrect. And when confronted with this, we go into what is called denial. Oh no, I'm right, even though my behavior proves me to be wrong. And so this is, in fact, what happens at the biggest level. Elizabeth Kubler-Ross talked about this in her very famous book, On Death and Dying was the name of it. Big bestseller. All the psychologists loved it because they recognized that she had put together something that, while she's talking about death itself, actually winds up with being the death of anything, not the death of the human. But when people are told by a doctor that, oh, you should have been in here before, I could have done something about that cyst, but now that cyst is eating your brain and you got 6 months to live. And the first thing they do is they say no. They deny it. And eventually, according to the Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, we go from denial through states of anger, into states of depression and compromise and other things like that, down to the level of acceptance. But even that level of acceptance is now a grudge. That the difference in that with the Buddha would be, let's find a way so that we can joyfully accept it without having to go through all of that bunch of states of misery, down to the final goal of acceptance, which is still based in misery, but we don't want it. But this whole idea of denial is what we wind up doing with everything that we don't like. It's not just our dying, but that's the big one. This is why the Buddha was really big on the issues of fearlessness. If you can become fearless in the face of death, then what is there to be afraid of? Including, let's not be afraid of looking at all the mistakes that we've been making so that we can begin to clean up our act and have a better life. But the Buddha was absolutely correct. Everything gets started in ignorance, and ignorance rots into delusion. And while that delusional stuff is happening, the mistakes get built up. Now, the next step is then the building up. That's the Saṅkhāra. So we have a jiva and then Saṅkhāra are the first two steps. And this is normally coming in regard to the present moment. This is stuff that's been built up out of the past and affects the present moment in ways that it need not, doesn't have to. That we can deal with the present moment in the present moment, but oftentimes through ignorance, we deal with the present moment the way that we've been dealing with old present moments, and that's our habit. And so we wind up dealing with this present moment the way that we used to deal with present moments, and we wind up perpetuating the same habits. Over and over and over again, we keep doing the same thing, and this is what we mean by the Saṅkhāra.
No, I always thought it looks like in the links that ignorance leads to Saṅkhāra. So without ignorance in the present moment, there wouldn't be anything, any inner knots or anything happening even. Because after that there comes Nāmarūpa and contact and so on. Are you still there?
Yes, I'm here.
Okay.
Temporary cable disconnect.
But I'm just interested, I guess, in how ignorance and Saṅkhāra link together, and if that means without...
Look at it in the sense of the past. Look at it from the sense that much of the stuff that you're going to have to deal with is stuff that you've been doing your whole life, all the way back to the first time that you did it. And so that ignorance goes all the way back. First there was ignorance, then you did it, then there was more ignorance, you did it again, there was more ignorance, you did it again, more ignorance, you did it again, all the way up to the present time, and now you've got a habit of it based in ignorance. And in that regard, present-day ignorance is the same as the one in the origin if you have the same stuff. But we're looking at it in the sense of how did the Saṅkhāras get built up? They got built up over time through ignorance. And so it repeated the same thing. Oh, in other words, the lesson was not learned.
Every time we repeat the Saṅkhāra, it's again in the present, ignorance happens and leads to us repeating that. Well, if in the present there was no ignorance concerning that specific thing.
Even if there is no ignorance in this moment, even if there is no ignorance in this moment, still there is the possibility that the Saṅkhāras will arise. And they can now arise ignorantly, and so the ignorance comes along with the arisal of the Saṅkhāra. This is the value, and we'll get into this in a little while when we start talking about practice.
Okay.
But right now we're just looking at the structural fact that old ignorance gave rise to old feeling systems and old ways of doing things, both emotionally and physically, and intellectually, making the same intellectual mistakes over and over and over again.
Mm.
All right. And in fact, we have three of them, three different styles. And each of these styles have different areas of the brain. The Buddha talks about there are three different kinds of Saṅkhāra. One is the bodily Saṅkhāra. In other words, the body has things. A musician will have stuff stored in his hand so that he can play the piano or the violin that ordinary people don't have, giving him dexterities and other things like that. In fact, what I have heard is that in the old days, violinists make really good safecrackers because they know how to listen and they know how to feel. And so he puts his ear to the next thing, and he's there with his left hand, and he's twisting that thing, even though he's right-handed. Why? Because the violin they use. So these are skills that are developed with the body, but we also have to recognize that the body, especially the body of a human, is different than many animals, because animals that are covered with fur and hair don't have as many neurons as humans do. But with our open skin exposed, those neurons then become receptors. So that as you open up the body, it becomes extraordinarily sensitive to the environment that it's in. Which means that in that regard, the body Saṅkhāra is stored all over the body, into the muscles, and right up through the brain stem, and that the whole body is controlled by the reptilian brain, that anything that you can do with your arms that a crocodile could do with his arms would have been only by the reptilian brain. But a crocodile, for instance, can't play the violin, so that needs some human stuff too. But by and large, much of the body is controlled, and all of the subconscious activities of the body are controlled by the reptilian brain. When people are sitting at the bus station nervous, you can see who's nervous because they cross their legs and they're tapping their foot, but some foot is working. What is that? That's the subconscious mind wanting to go someplace. Fidgeting with the hands means I want to do something with the hands, but I'm not aware of what's going on. I'm ignorant. I'm not watching what's happening with the body. So the body is controlled by that reptilian brain, and the job of the reptilian brain is to keep you alive. This is the, let us say, the primary survival equipment, which is called the survival instinct. All of our instinctual behavior that keeps us alive is buried into this back area of the brain. So when you're moving around at night, that part of the brain is doing that. Heartbeat, normal breathing that is not conscious is also controlled by that reptilian brain. So let's talk about the next group. Besides the body, the second group would be, I'll do it in the order this is in the text, though I have a reason for doing it in a different order. The next one is what we call vocal Saṅkhāra. All of the vocal Saṅkhāra is the kind of activities that a human will have that has to do with interrelationships with the outside world, most specifically with other people. It's our language. It's our concepts, our thoughts. When we're thinking, we almost always think verbally. Sometimes a few pictures flash up, but most of the time we're telling ourselves a story, or we're laying out a concept. This is the stuff that's stored in the mid-cortex of the brain, in our language centers associated with the ears, etc., and this is what the scientists call the mammalian brain. This is associated with the kind of storage and informational systems that give us English language or French. And one of the things that they found is little children can pick up a second language much quicker than that same child when he becomes 13, 14, and 15. And yet in many places, even in the United States, foreign language isn't taught to high school. If you want to teach your child foreign language, you need to teach him foreign language while he's 6, 7, 8, 9, and 10 years old. He'll pick it up very quickly. So that part of the brain kind of gets ossified by the time that we're about 12 years old, which is basically about the life span of a mammal. Like dogs or horses, cattle. They only live 10 to 20 years. And so that frame of reference is that stuff gets set. But then there's another kind of Saṅkhāra. And this is the funny thing, because in the realm of Saṅkhāra, we're not putting Saṅkhāra in the frontal cortex, but we're putting the Citta Saṅkhāra. And this is one of the problems with the English text, is that the word Citta here is very clearly indicating emotional mental states, but that they normally will translate the word Citta here as mind, in the sense that it's all of it, or even the thinking part of the brain. Where in fact, no, this Citta Saṅkhāra here in the Thai language, in the Pali, is the word Jai, which means emotional. And that's exactly what Bhikkhu Buddhadasa is talking about, and you can see that in the suttas, that this Citta Saṅkhāra is most importantly looked at in the sense of emotional. In other words, we think by feeling, and our thoughts and our feelings are interrelated, but that these feeling systems that we have and our memory systems that work with them are stored in the back of the brain behind the reptilian brain in an area called the cerebellum. Have you ever heard of that? Which they call the source of memory. Mostly this, though, is the source of emotional memory.
Yeah, we talked about this before, and I looked that up a bit because I was a bit surprised, because most I could find is that it's just has to do with movement a lot, like also regulating micro movements and taking care that our movements are fluid and not really cut off. But I couldn't find anything about memory, or I'm not sure if about feeling.
When people get hit in the back of the head, that will most likely, or let us say it is possible, let's turn it around. Amnesia. When people have amnesia, normally it's because of a blow to this back part of the head, which either temporarily disrupts it or permanently damages it. And one of the most confusing things about people with amnesia is they don't know how to feel about things. And so they wind up in almost a steady state of confusion. And they don't like that state of confusion, so they want to go figure it out. They want to go get their past. Almost everyone who has amnesia, their number one goal in life is to restore that memory system. So they don't like that deep state of confusion of not knowing how to feel. But in any case, this emotional Saṅkhāra, regardless of where it's stored in the body, is in fact that which is caused by the ignorance about making the same mistakes. And when I'm saying making the same mistakes is anytime someone winds up feeling not happy, not joyful, not on top of the world, they're having the feelings that they would choose not to have if they had that choice. In that regard, I would say anger, sadness, grief, despair, anxiety, all of the list of emotions that are negative, people would choose not to have those emotions. So when they do have those emotions, they're just repeating the same mistakes that they were making when they were a child. Because that child would have also said, oh, I would much rather be happy than to be jealous, envious. So this is what we're meaning, that all of that stuff that's stored about how to feel, we practice that over our lifetimes. And that the surprise is that the part of the feeling that is most well exercised is that of either the feeling of I don't like it, or the feeling of liking it that doesn't stay at just I like it, but rather moves to an object of I want it. And we'll get into that in a moment. But right now we're just laying the foundation that most of the Saṅkhāra that's built up is not pleasurable feelings, but it's feelings of desire, feelings of anger, jealousy, anxiety, and all of the bad feelings that we have. All right, and we can bring all of that stuff right up to this present moment. In any present moment, what we can say is now the Saṅkhāra has already been laid down for all of these years, plus right up to yesterday, and then right up to an hour ago, and then right up to a minute ago, and then right up to a second ago, and everything, the time is moving, and everything in the past can then be called this ignorant Saṅkhāra system that we've got going on. And now let's come up to the present moment. The present moment starts with consciousness. Consciousness means that we can be in the sense organ. There are 6 of these sense organs. Normally, the human being would say that primarily the sense organ that's used the most by humans would be the eyes. And that when someone loses their eyes and doesn't have use of that sense organ, then that greatly diminishes their lifestyle. The next one would be hearing, the ability to hear. Another one, which is also right up there, would be touch. But taste and smell we don't use so much. We use taste more. But what I've heard is that actually taste only have 5 basic things, like sweet, salty, bitter, sour, that kind of thing. But that most of the flavors that we have are done through the combination of the olfactory system working with it.
Yeah.
So what that means is that the olfactory system that the humans now have is much more interested in working with eating food, but that most animals, especially mammals, operate a lot with olfactory. Sexuality for most animals is highly, highly associated with olfactory. So when hormones and pheromones and whatnot are given out, everybody becomes interested in what that smells like. And a female dog can be in heat right in your house, and you won't even know it until you look out in the yard and you find 5 dogs out there fighting, either trying to get in or fighting with each other. How did they know that when the humans don't? It's because the humans do not have, or they have lost their ability to discern things. In fact, one of the qualities that allow some dogs, like a bloodhound, to be able to track is because they can smell stereoscopically. In other words, they can move their nose back and forth across the path and recognize, oh, the scent is here and it's there. And they can do that because of the distinction between how they smell from the left and the right nostril, just like you can get sense of direction by your hearing.
Wow.
Isn't that amazing? And humans have lost that almost completely. Part of our DNA. It's not something that you can train for to recover. Being part of the human means that you have lost a sense that many other animals have in abundance. But those are the 5. There's one more, and that is within the human, there is also the mental capability, and that's what we mean by just having the mind just run and roar, that we're not paying attention to anything in the senses. We're only paying attention to what the mind itself is doing. And what the mind itself is doing is normally in the past or in the future or wanting things, and we call these the 5 hindrances. It's just having that mind. And basically what we're intending to do is to stop spending so much time in that 6 mental state and come back and spend more and more time in the sensory world. This is actually what we mean by be here now. Be here, the here is observable. And the only way to observe the present moment is right now, that I cannot look at that mouse, for instance, the way that it was before it was manufactured. I can only see it the way that it is now. And I cannot see it right now the way it's going to be when somebody stomps on it. I can only see what it looks like now. This is the present moment in the kind of the long run. But that's the way that we begin to look at it. Oh, we're going to come out of the mental past and future and stay more and more time in the present moment.
And if we try to recognize things as this is contact, this is feeling, and so on, isn't that also mind activity or mind?
Well, right now we're working with consciousness, thinking about what are you going to spend your time in consciousness on. Now, the Buddha talked about consciousness like a fire, and that many different kinds of fire are known by the fuel for that fire. So there is a house fire, there's a grass fire, there's a log fire, there's a car fire, there's a forest fire. Okay, gas fire, all kinds of fire. So consciousness is known by its fuel. And the fuel for that consciousness is going to be the eye and what the eye contacts. And so consciousness is going to have the ear as fuel. And the ear consciousness is different than the eye consciousness. And it is very difficult to see both of them operating at the same time. In fact, almost always it's a good idea for students to begin to understand a bit about consciousness is to try to read something on the screen while they're listening to something else completely unrelated. Like listening to a news broadcast or talking about what happened today while you're watching a documentary about what happened 2 days ago or something. And you'll find, wait a minute, consciousness, you can't keep both of them going. That if you start listening, that the eyes will start wandering, but you're not watching what you're reading. But if you start to read, you're absolutely going to miss something that was said.
No.
So eye consciousness and ear consciousness are different things, but that we have to break or shift. And in that regard, all kinds of consciousness is dependently arising, and that it arises and passes away. It's temporary. There's nothing permanent about consciousness. But in fact, while we're sleeping, there's no consciousness. While we're knocked out, while we're drugged, while we're under anesthetic, there is no consciousness. And so consciousness is dependent, and it's dependent upon the contact for the eye. So let's use eye as the example. The form we see is just merely partially processed. That what the eyes actually do see is color, shape, or forms, and movement. Everything else has to be then interpreted. So as we see something on the outside, we bring that into the neural network and begin to process it. In fact, they found that the object nerve itself does part of the processing to get the rods and cones and just the pixels basically arranged into shapes and movements and colors, so that the colors have particular shapes and whatnot. So this data now is already fairly well organized and ready for it to be interpreted. This interpretation, we often in English use the word perception. Another way that we could call it would be preception. And we'll talk about what that means in a moment. But the word sept in this case means to see, and we're already talking about the eye. So perception means to take the data that comes from the eye and be able to conceive it or to make it internal. And the process that we go through with that is called perception. In the Pali, it's called Nāmarūpa. And what that means is taking the rupa, the external object, and naming it. In this case, like the word tree, I see a tree. And I know it's a tree because I've seen a lot of trees, and I'm comparing it with all of the trees, and I come up with, yep, that's a palm tree. I see it. There it is. I've seen palm trees before. This is not the first palm tree I've seen. What this means is now that perception is taking input from two different places. It's taking input from the eyes, and it's also taking input from the memory banks that we now have already labeled as Saṅkhāra. And this is the part where most people don't understand, is in this present moment, all of that past stuff that we had in Saṅkhāra is now going to be used in order to be able to interpret this present moment. And if there is any data that is received from the Saṅkhāra or our storage system, like say a hard drive on a laptop, and any of that data is polluted, then we're going to come up with a conception that might be polluted. Now, we already know several things about memory. Memory is quite shoddy. Dogs don't have much of a memory. Very slow for dogs to learn. They don't read. They don't read books. Why? Because they don't have the intellectual capability of the kind of learning that it would take to learn a language. But they have had monkeys. There was one of them, I think she's died now, but she had gotten more than 600 signs. She was a gorilla, and she knew enough to where she could have logical conversations with people in sign language. Blew you away. You'd think, this is a gorilla. This is not human, and yet she's acting as human as most humans do, because she's got language skills. But it took a long time for her to learn that. It took her a lifetime to learn 600 words. But here we are with our system, and so we pick up this stuff out of the past to be able to name things, which means to recognize, or to look at the word recognize, to recognize, to do it again. When we recognize something, that means that we've seen it before, and we know we've seen it before because the memory of what it is stored in there.
It just in between, I still gotta go to work and I gotta get ready soon. Maybe we can continue this topic tomorrow.
Yes, sure.
Great.
We're just getting into it. You wanted Paticca Samuppada, where you're getting it. And we're just now getting into perception. But look, we have covered ignorance, we have covered Saṅkhāra, we have covered consciousness, and now we're dealing with perception, the most difficult part about how perception and Saṅkhāra take the conscious things that we have and make something internal. That internal is called the Saḻāyatana. And so I'll leave you with this. The Saḻāyatana is what we mean when we say we realize something, except that we don't realize it. To realize a tree would mean that I have one growing out of my head. But what we do is we mentalize it. And our mentalizations are what we live our lives by, not the actual object. It has to go through the perception process, and often adding feeling components into that are unnecessary, unuseful, and will then start to color the way that we feel. And now we brought it up to at least the first half.
Yeah.
And we'll start into that first half, and we'll continue on with Paticca Samuppada and see we didn't get to talk about the four modes of clinging after all. We didn't even got that far. We're only dealing with what happens in the first split second of the mind.
Yeah.
And yet most people, when they say, I see something on the outside, it means they do see it. And they don't. What they see is a mental constructed image of it inside the mind. We do not live in the real world. We live in a mentally constructed world. And the closer that mentally constructed world is to the outside world, the less likely we are to have feelings. And the less likely we are to have feelings, the more likely we are we're not going to have any suffering at all. This present moment has no suffering. But boy, did we have a bunch of it in the past, and all we need to do then is to remember it, and there we are, suffering again.
All right, we'll have more suffering in the next few days.
This is great. We'll cut it off here, so go enjoy your day.
Yeah, thank you.
Or night.
Bye.